For 13 days in October 1962, every man, woman, and child on Earth was 13 minutes away from complete annihilation. Soviet nuclear missiles sat 90 miles from Florida. American bombers circled the skies with hydrogen bombs armed. One wrong move, one miscommunication, one nervous soldier with a shaky finger. And human civilization would have ended in radioactive fire. This was not a movie. This was the Cold War. This is Clusterstory, where we take a deep dive into history to get a great understanding of how we got here. Hit the subscribe button, turn on the bell, like and share this video. Now let us go back to understand how two superpowers brought humanity to the edge of extinction without ever firing a single shot at each other directly, the world in ashes. The year is 1945. World War II has just ended. 60 million people are dead. Europe lies in ruins. Cities that stood for centuries have been reduced to rubble and ash. But something strange is happening among the victors. The United States and the Soviet Union had just fought side by side to defeat Nazi Germany. They shook hands over the corpse of Hitler's empire. They posed for photographs. They celebrated together. Yet beneath those smiles, a terrible suspicion was growing. You see, these two nations could not have been more different. They represented two completely opposite visions of how human beings should live. The United States believed in capitalism, private ownership, individual freedom, democracy. The right to vote, to speak freely, to build your own business and keep your own wealth. The Soviet Union believed in communism, collective ownership. The state controls everything. The farms, the factories, the newspapers, all property belongs to everyone, which in practice meant the government decided who got what. These two ideas could not coexist peacefully. Each side believed the other system would eventually collapse. Each side believed their way of life was the future of humanity. And now, with Europe weakened and the old empires crumbling, both superpowers saw their chance to reshape the entire world. Drawing the Iron Curtain, imagine a map of Europe in 1945. As the Nazi forces retreated, American and British troops advanced from the west. Soviet troops advanced from the east. Whoever liberated a territory got to decide its future. The Soviets reached Eastern Europe first: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had no intention of leaving. He installed communist governments in each of these nations. Elections were rigged. Opposition leaders disappeared. Independent newspapers were shut down. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, gave a famous speech in 1946. He said an iron curtain had descended across the continent. On one side, freedom; on the other side, Soviet control. That phrase, the Iron Curtain, would define the next 4 decades. But here is what made this conflict unlike any before it. Both sides now possessed nuclear weapons. The United States had dropped atomic bombs on Japan to end World War II. The Soviets successfully tested their own bomb in 1949. Suddenly, the stakes of any direct conflict became infinite. A conventional war between these powers would escalate to nuclear war, and nuclear war meant the end of everything. This is why they called it the Cold War. It was a war of tension, espionage, propaganda, and proxy conflicts. But the two main enemies never fought each other directly, because if they did, no one would survive. The Berlin Crisis. Nowhere was the Cold War more visible than in the city of Berlin. After World War II, Germany was divided into 4 zones. The Americans, British, and French controlled the western zones. The Soviets controlled the east. Berlin, the former capital, sat deep inside Soviet-controlled territory, but it too was divided. West Berlin became a tiny island of Western democracy surrounded by communist East Germany. Stalin hated this arrangement. In 1948, he decided to force the Western powers out. He blocked all roads, railways, and canals into West Berlin. 2 million people were cut off from food, fuel, and medicine. The Soviets expected the West to abandon the city. Instead, something incredible happened. The United States and Britain launched the Berlin airlift. For nearly a year, cargo planes flew into West Berlin around the clock. One plane landed every 30 seconds at the peak. They delivered over 2 million tons of supplies. Stalin eventually lifted the blockade. He had lost the first major confrontation of the Cold War, but the story of Berlin was far from over. Throughout the 1950s, East Germans fled to the west through Berlin. Nearly 3 million people escaped communist rule. The embarrassment was too much for the Soviets to bear. On the night of August 13, 1961, East German soldiers began laying barbed wire through the heart of Berlin. Within days, a concrete wall divided the city. Families were separated overnight. People who went to work in the West could never return home to the East. The Berlin Wall became the most powerful symbol of the Cold War. It stood for 28 years as a monument to division, oppression, and the great ideological battle of the 20th century. The nuclear arms race while walls were being built, something far more terrifying was happening in secret laboratories and missile silos across both superpowers. The arms race had begun. The logic was simple and horrifying. If your enemy has 10 nuclear weapons, you need 20. If they have 100, you need 200. Neither side could afford to fall behind. By the 1960s, both nations had enough nuclear weapons to destroy the entire world several times over. This was called mutually assured destruction. The acronym appropriately spelled MAD. The strategy worked like this: if you attack us, we will destroy you. If we attack you, you will destroy us. Therefore, no one can attack. The weapons exist not to be used, but to prevent their use. It sounds insane because it was insane. The survival of human civilization depended on rational actors never making a mistake. Both sides built intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach enemy cities in 30 minutes. They built nuclear submarines that could hide beneath the oceans and launch devastating strikes. They built bomber fleets that stayed airborne at all times, ready to deliver destruction at a moment's notice. The world lived under this shadow for decades. School children practiced hiding under their desks in nuclear drills. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards. Civil defense sirens were tested every week. An entire generation grew up wondering if they would live to see adulthood, 13 days in October. And then came the moment when the nightmare almost became real. In October 1962, American spy planes discovered something alarming in Cuba. The Soviet Union was secretly installing nuclear missiles on the island, just 90 miles from Florida. President John F. Kennedy faced an impossible choice. If those missiles became operational, the Soviets could strike American cities with almost no warning. But any military action against Cuba risked starting World War III. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba. Any Soviet ship approaching the island would be stopped and searched. If they tried to run the blockade, American forces would open fire. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Soviet ships carrying more missiles sailed toward Cuba. American warships waited with weapons ready. In the skies, American bombers loaded with nuclear weapons flew continuous patrols. Several times, the situation nearly spiraled out of control. A Soviet submarine was detected and cornered by American destroyers. The submarine crew, exhausted and unable to communicate with Moscow, believed war had already started. Two officers wanted to launch their nuclear torpedo. Only the objection of a third officer, Vasily Arkhipov, stopped them. One man, one decision, and human civilization survived. Finally, after secret negotiations, the Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba. In exchange, the Americans promised not to invade the island and secretly agreed to remove their own missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was over, but it had shown both sides how close they had come to destroying everything. In the years that followed, direct communication lines were established between Washington and Moscow. Both sides became more careful about pushing too hard. The world had stared into the abyss and stepped back the space race. Not all Cold War competition was deadly. Some of it pushed humanity to achieve things previously thought impossible. Both superpowers saw space as the ultimate frontier. Whoever dominated space would dominate the world's imagination. And perhaps someday whoever controlled space could control Earth itself. The Soviets struck first. In 1957, they launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. It was nothing but a metal ball with radio transmitters. But its beeping signal, heard around the world, announced that the Soviets had beaten America to space. The shock in the United States was enormous. If the Soviets could put a satellite in orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead anywhere on Earth. 4 years later, the Soviets struck again. Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to travel to space. He orbited the Earth once and returned safely. Another Soviet triumph. President Kennedy responded with an audacious challenge. Before the decade was out, America would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. It seemed impossible. The technology did not exist. The challenges were unprecedented, but the prestige was irresistible. On July 20, 1969, astronaut Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. His words echoed across the planet, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." America had won the most spectacular battle of the Cold War. The moon landing demonstrated technological superiority and captured the world's imagination in a way no military victory ever could. Proxy wars and global struggles. While the superpowers avoided direct confrontation, they fought each other through allies, proxies, and interventions across the globe: Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Chile. The pattern repeated endlessly. When a country seemed to be moving toward communism, the United States intervened. When a country seemed to be moving toward Western democracy, the Soviets intervened. The human cost was staggering. In Korea, the peninsula was divided into communist North and capitalist South. A brutal war from 1952-1953 killed nearly 3 million people. The border remains heavily militarized to this day. In Vietnam, the United States spent over a decade trying to prevent communist forces from taking over the South. Nearly 60,000 Americans died. Over 1 million Vietnamese were killed. In the end, the communists won anyway. In Afghanistan, the Soviets invaded in 1979 to support a communist government. The United States armed and funded the resistance fighters called the Mujahideen. After 10 years of brutal warfare, the Soviets withdrew in defeat. But the chaos left behind would eventually give rise to the Taliban and other extremist groups. Each of these conflicts had its own history and its own tragedy, but they were all connected by the same global struggle: two superpowers using smaller nations as battlefields for their ideological war. The beginning of the end. By the 1980s, cracks were appearing in the Soviet system. The communist economy was failing. Store shelves were empty. Technological innovation lagged decades behind the West. People whispered complaints they would never dare speak aloud. In 1985, a new leader came to power in the Soviet Union. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev, and he recognized that something had to change. Gorbachev introduced two revolutionary policies. Glasnost, meaning openness, allowed greater freedom of speech and press. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, attempted to reform the failing economy. But instead of saving the system, these reforms accelerated its collapse. As information flowed more freely, people learned how badly they had been lied to. As restrictions loosened, long-suppressed nationalist movements emerged across the Soviet republics. Poland held free elections. Hungary opened its border to the west. Czechoslovakia experienced its own peaceful revolution. And then, on November 9, 1989, the unthinkable happened. The Berlin Wall fell. Thousands of East Germans flooded through the checkpoints. Strangers embraced. People danced on top of the wall. Pieces of concrete were chipped away as souvenirs. The symbol that had divided Europe for a generation was being torn apart by bare hands. Within 2 years, Germany was reunified. Within 3 years, the Soviet Union itself had dissolved. 15 new nations emerged from its ruins. The Cold War was over. The world left behind. So what does the Cold War mean for us today? Its legacy surrounds us, even if we do not always recognize it. The nuclear weapons are still there. Thousands of warheads remain ready to launch on both sides. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction still shapes international relations. The conflicts born in the Cold War era continue to haunt us. The divided Korean peninsula, the instability in the Middle East, The tensions between Russia and the West. NATO, the military alliance formed to counter the Soviet threat, still exists and has expanded. Russia, viewing this expansion as a threat, has pushed back aggressively. The relationship between Moscow and Washington remains complicated and dangerous. But perhaps the most important legacy is psychological. For 45 years, humanity lived with the knowledge that it could destroy itself. We built machines capable of ending civilization and pointed them at each other. We came within minutes of launching them. We survived not because of our wisdom, but because of our luck. The Cold War taught us that human beings are capable of creating forces they cannot fully control. It taught us that ideological differences can become so extreme that we risk everything to defeat our enemies. It taught us that peace is fragile and must be constantly maintained. Final thoughts: the Cold War was not just about capitalism versus communism. It was about two visions of humanity fighting for dominance without ever being able to defeat each other directly. It gave us the space race and the nuclear nightmare. It liberated some nations and devastated others. It defined the second half of the 20th century and created the world we live in today. The wall that divided Berlin has been down for over 30 years now. The Soviet Union exists only in history books. But the questions the Cold War raised remain unanswered. How do we live with weapons capable of destroying everything? How do we bridge ideological divides that seem impossible to cross? How do we build a world where different systems can coexist without threatening mutual annihilation? These are questions we still struggle to answer, because the Cold War may have ended, but the world it created is still ours to navigate. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of history's most dangerous and defining conflicts. If this video helped you understand how we got here, hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and share this with someone who loves history. Until next time, this has been Cluster Story.